order to keep profits as healthy as possible, companies must manage costs. To do that, managers and their accountants must understand costs in ways that lead to effective decisions, which in turn lead to healthy profits. But defining and measuring costs is not always simple to do.
Well, I think it is really difficult to be able to get the right costs associated with the right size or the right product. Frequently, we allocate a lot of costs based on volume, based on hours run, hours produced, floor space. We've got any number of allocation systems, but anytime you're trying to allocate costs where you can't clearly identify that this cost is directly associated with this particular product, it becomes pretty subjective.
Yeah, the term cost is very slippery. It doesn't seem like it should be slippery. It seems like it should be very well defined term with no ambiguity whatsoever. But in fact, it's used in many, many different ways by people inside business and in everyday life.
Defining costs can be particularly challenging when a large component of a company's product is creativity, which is the case with a Disney animated film.
You start with a business plan and a budget, and you have a creative idea, and in between that, there's a big gap. So we sit in that gap, and we try to look at creative issues and quantify them.
In most manufacturing operations, there are a number of costs that are difficult to tie accurately to a product. Take electricity, for example.
We use electricity everywhere in the plant. Well, how much of it should be charged to liquid Clorox 2? How much of it should be charged to our bleach business? And what about the power that's used in our distribution center? We have to allocate that back to the manufacturing side of the house and then split it again between a couple of products. So the more often you do those kinds of things, the less accurate your figures become. I think that's probably the most difficult piece that we have to deal with.
Significant change. And
one of the most basic aspects of cost management is being able to predict the impact of changing costs. As the activity level in a company rises and falls, certain costs will rise and fall or remain the same. For planning purposes, a manager must be able to anticipate which way prices will move when conditions change, and how much prices will fluctuate.
If you don't have a concrete base of history gathered that tells you specifically why expenditures were at a certain level and why operational costs are at a certain level, historically we have no chance at all of predicting what the future is. So if you're gathering the historical operation accurately, you're documenting that, and you're understanding the impacts of that. What is the real impact of a drop in efficiency of 10%? What's the impact of a drop in efficiency of 5%? Is it half? Is it exponential? So once you understand those baselines of what's causing your problems, what's causing your expense now, then you can take that and form a model around that gives you the best predictor of future expenditures.
To help make these determinations, costs are often categorized as variable or fixed. A variable cost increases or decreases in direct proportion to increases or decreases in a level of activity, such as units produced, units sold, hours worked, and so on. While total variable costs change, per unit costs remain the same.
Some months we have a lot of volume, next month we have very little. So labor, our glue, filter aids and supplies, maintenance, all that part of our cost system is pretty variable and moves around with our volume.
A fixed cost remains constant in total, regardless of changes in the level of activity within a relevant range. Examples include factory rent and equipment depreciation. Fixed cost per unit changes inversely with the number of units produced. More units produced from a fixed cost reduces per unit cost, and vice versa.
our knitwear's business is more fixed cost oriented because we have a large investment in a fabric mill. It's one of the largest fabric mills of its kind in the country. So that puts a premium on us keeping that mill full because fixed costs, by their definition, are fixed and don't go away when you're not running fabric through there.
To summarize cost behavior, variable costs change in total, but are constant on a per unit basis. Fixed costs are constant in total, but vary inversely on a per-unit basis. Another way companies manage resources is by assigning costs to cost objects, such as products. This process helps managers determine prices, perform profitability studies, and control spending. A cost object can be anything that managers want to track. For purposes of assigning costs to cost objects, costs are classified as either direct or indirect. Direct costs are easy and convenient to connect to an object because that object pretty clearly causes the cost to occur. Direct materials is an example, but other costs, such as designing and testing a new product, would also be direct. Indirect costs, such as utilities in a multi-product factory, are not easily or conveniently traced to a partial product.
We have those direct costs like raw and packaging materials, our labor, but then there are certainly other costs that go along with the company: advertising expense, sales expense, logistics and transportation, which is actually our largest single cost, is getting our product to our customer.
On the direct side, clearly we have several thousand artists who are drawing artwork that end up in the film. So most of our direct costs are actually labor costs. On the indirect side, we have a variety of different costs. We have a number of overhead departments that support the general production departments, such as human resources, finance, communications, and things like that. So we have indirect labor there. We also then have some indirect other expense costs associated with running those departments.
For decision-making purposes, costs are further divided into differential cost, opportunity cost, and sunk cost. A difference in cost between any two alternatives is a differential cost. These costs can be fixed or variable. For example, the decision to make or buy a part requires distinguishing between costs that differ between the two alternatives. In some cases, differences in revenue will also be examined. For example, deciding whether to accept a special customer order, which may not cover certain fixed costs.
We have to, as managers, think through each decision independently and identify which costs are relevant and which costs are not relevant for that decision. Now, if we design accounting systems correctly, we can get categories that are going to be more useful for that purpose, but it's still not going to be automatic. Managers are still going to have to think very carefully about what costs are relevant and which costs are not relevant before making a decision.
Part of decision-making involves consideration of the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the potential benefit that's given up when one alternative is selected over another. For example, the contribution margin lost from cutting back production of one product to make room for the production of another. Finally, there are sunk costs. A sunk cost is a cost that has already been incurred and it can't be changed by any decision made now or in the future. For Clorox, the sunk cost of a specialized piece of equipment used to produce a new product would not be a factor if it becomes necessary to choose whether or not to continue manufacturing the product.
So that's kind of a cost of doing business in their introduction of a new product. If the product turns out not to be successful, we've clearly defined what our sunk cost is, and we understand how that's impacted the organization.
However costs are classified, they are useful in understanding cost patterns, analyzing performance, and planning future operations. Ultimately, the decisions that a company must make dictates the method it uses for determining costs. A management accountant, like a good tailor, designs the cost accounting process that is best suited to the decisions made in his or her organization. Whatever the business, cost classification is based on how costs will be used, preparing external reports, planning budgets, and making decisions. When valuing inventories and determining expenses for the balance sheet and income statement, costs are classified as either product costs or period costs. Period costs are costs such as rent and administrative expenses, which are tied to a reporting period rather than a specific product. Product costs are raw materials, labor, and manufacturing overhead that can be traced to a product. To help management track and assess expenditures for planning and decision-making, costs are sorted into additional classifications. For predicting cost behavior, such as the impact of increasing output at a manufacturing plant, expenses are classified as variable or fixed. To assign costs to objects for pricing, profitability studies, and control of spending, costs are classified as direct or indirect. And finally, to help management compare alternatives, costs are further classified as differential, opportunity, and sunk. In the end, calculating costs isn't a cut-and-dried process. Managerial accountants must tailor internal and external reports to reflect each company's unique cost issues.